Hello everyone! I just realized that I'm really excited about recording a video today, so hopefully that will show that I'm very happy today. But anyway, so what I wanted to talk about in this video is my experience of reaching C2 level in English. The point of this video is not to show off, because I really don't care about showing off, that's just not my thing, but rather I want to try and give you a realistic idea of what it is like to actually reach C2 level in a language, or let's say a really high level of proficiency in the language. Before I actually start the video, I just want to give a bit of context about my English. So I started learning English when I was 11 back in France, but it wasn't really serious for me, English, up until I turned 17, I think, because that's when I really started getting interested in English. And then when I was 18 up to 21, I did a degree in English. And since I'm 21, I've been living in the UK. So it's been 7 years now. So it's quite a long time. And I just wanted to discuss ideas of how people think it might feel like to be very proficient in a language. And I will tell you how it actually is, in my opinion. Obviously, for sure, other people's experiences will be different. But anyway, let's get started. So the first point I wanted to raise is that you will never sound native. And I know people get quite triggered when I say this, but it is the truth. You will never sound native. It is possible that you might get super close, or maybe you'll manage to fool a few people, but just because you manage to fool a few people doesn't make you native. And if you don't like this statement, let's maybe say that it's extremely unlikely that most of you will sound native to native speakers. I know personally I can always tell when someone is not a native speaker. I have in mind Luca Lampariello, who has a very good level of French. His French is honestly, his accent is really clear, really good, excellent. But if I really pay attention, I can definitely tell he's not a native speaker. And sounding native is not just about the accent as well. It's also about the words you choose, and that's really hard to have the same word choice as a native speaker, because that requires a lot of exposure to the language. And in my opinion, and based on the readings and research I've done on bilingualism, because this is what I studied for my master's in linguistics, if you start learning a language after you're 7, maybe 11, 13, I think, which is usually the critical period hypothesis, which is, if I exaggerate and simplify it a lot, the age at which you would stop sounding native or be considered like a native speaker by other people, essentially. But sounding native is not just about the accent, and I think that's a misconception. Sounding native is much more than that. It's also about word choice when you're phrasing things. Some things for native speakers will just sound unnatural, even if the grammar is perfect. There's also the cultural knowledge of the culture. You know, it can be just cultural references. You know, it can be history, it can be pop culture. I mean, lots and lots of things that native speakers, or most of them anyway, will know, but that you won't know because you haven't been exposed to the culture the same way. You have your own native culture. And these are just examples. There's other things that would make you sound non-native. Something else I wanted to add about this statement, which is you will never sound native, is that a lot of people tell me that when I say that, it's incredibly demotivating and negative, but actually it's not. I myself accepted the fact that I will never sound native, and I think once you integrate that in your mind, you just will stop trying to be perfect, because sounding native is an unreachable goal for a large majority of people, and there's no point to pursue a goal which, to be honest, is not that useful. And in fact, I think there's an advantage of not sounding native or coming across as a non-native speaker, which is that people will be way more forgiving when you make mistakes. Maybe you will use the wrong word, maybe what you say will come across as a little bit more abrupt than what native speakers would say. But if people know you're not a native speaker, they will be way more forgiving. However, if you did sound native, potentially, then people will just assume you're being rude, and that could cause a few problems, I think. So I do like to think of it that way, that if people know I'm not a native speaker, then I can get away with many more things than someone that does sound native, or that is perceived as a native speaker of the language. The second thing I wanted to talk about is the fact that reaching a high proficiency in the language takes years, maybe decades I don't know. I still feel like I'm learning English, and I'm not so much saying that, you know, I learn a word every day, because, you know, anyone, even native speakers, can learn new words. But what I mean is that being really fluent and really competent in the language is not even all about pronunciation and vocab and perfect grammar. It's also about being able to use language appropriately depending on the context. So in some contexts you will have to be formal and use the right type of vocab or sentence structures, etc. While in other contexts, if you sounded too formal, so for example with friends, you will come across as weird. So the idea is that it takes a long time to really use language in a smooth way. And this is exactly why my eyes roll when people say things like, you can learn a language in a year or in 6 months or whatever, because there is no way you can be a competent speaker of a language in only a year. Maybe 2 years. I think that's quite difficult. Possible, but that would require a lot of exposure to the language and a lot of study, most likely. I mean, it is possible to be critical about what I just said, because, you know, it depends on the proficiency you actually want. You know, some people just want to be able to have a chat in the language. But here, because I'm talking about, you know, high fluency in the language, I don't think this is realistic. Again, I'm sure someone is going to tell me in the comment section, well, I know this guy in 2 years he was a native speaker in the language. I mean, sure, that is technically possible. I can't say that's not possible, but it's not a realistic target and thing to have in mind, because this is a huge minority. There's not a lot of people that would go for 2 years in full immersion in the country to learn the language, because that's practically not very doable. Possible, but not very doable for most people. The third thing, and I cannot say the third thing fluently, so here you go, I'm not perfect. So anyway, the third point is that you need to step out of your comfort zone. I talk about this all the time, but it's so important. And the comfort zone will mean different things for different people. But essentially what it means is that if you stay in your comfort zone, you will always be doing things that you already know. So for example, if you are only reading books that are too easy for you, or that are just at the right level but don't have any challenge, you know, there's nothing new you can learn from doing this activity. If you're watching, I don't know if that's realistic, but if you're watching the same show on and on and on, like, you will be so familiar with it that eventually you will not be learning very much more new things. So it's important, I think, to really try new things and be uncomfortable. So by uncomfortable, I'm not saying be in a very uncomfortable position, but just, you know, intellectually uncomfortable. So I can give you some examples. I made a list. So for me, it was to read news regularly in English. It was to read books in subjects in English that I wasn't familiar with, such as science, psychology, why not? Also talk to lots of native speakers, have friends who are native speakers as well as non-native speakers, because that allows me to understand non-native accents more efficiently, more easily, and I think I can now. I also moved to England. I took 2 degrees in England. I also made this channel, I got a job in England, etc, etc. And all these experiences contributed to me improving my language skills one way or another. You know, studying at university allowed me to be able to use English in an academic context. Having a job helped me to write emails in a formal way. You know, and the list goes on, but I think you get the idea. And I think this has been really important for me to improve my level of English. It's to just create new situations for me where I could actually improve my language skills and make my English proficiency grow, if I may say. Number 4, even if you're perfectly fluent in a language, you'll sometimes think that you're not good enough. And I cannot tell you how many times I've managed to convince myself that my English was not good enough. I sometimes have these thoughts which are like, oh, my pronunciation is bad, or oh, how can I still make this grammatical mistake in English, or oh, I should have proofread this better, they're going to think I'm a bad speaker of English, and all these negative thoughts. I'm no exception, I have them all the time. It did get better over time because I did manage to work on it and just accept that my imperfections are part of me, you know, in English. I'm never going to get rid of them. I'm always going to make mistakes. I'm always going to have that French accent. I mean, even though I try to, you know, soften it, I will still have this accent and I will still have lots of issues with my English. I don't think they're issues, they're just natural, they're just normal. You know, it would be unrealistic for me to pursue perfection in English. And I actually think it's part of my identity to have an accent. And in fact, in my experience, that actually starts up a lot of conversations. People are always going to be like, oh, where are you from? Where does your accent come from? And I even make it a joke. I'm like, oh, guess, like, what do you think I'm from? And that actually creates a lot of funny interactions. But that's just the story I've decided to tell, which is that English, you know, my flaws in English are something that's all positive, that actually create, you know, interesting conversations. You could also decide to tell yourself that your English is the worst and that you're stupid or whatever, but then it's your choice. You know, do you want to feel great about your English or bad about it, or any other language, of course. I decided that I would feel positive about my English. I do still have negative thoughts about it, but I accept it. You know, I often see how I could improve my English when I edit my videos. I see that I mispronounced something or I made a grammatical mistake, even though I try to prepare my videos. But you know, I often improvise, so I'm bound to make mistakes. I also sometimes make spelling mistakes when I write in English. Lots of things like that. But I decided that first of all, it makes me interesting one way or another, and also if I can get my message across, I think that's the main thing. So yeah, I think that's an important thing to work on. And this one is more like personal development thing rather than purely linguistic thing. It's all about the mindset, I think. Anyway, that's it for this video. I hope you didn't mind my rambling on. I usually have some kind of script, but I decided to just improvise. Yeah, I just prefer to improvise. I also hope that you got value out of this video. That would make me very happy. And I will see you next week, and bye.